everyone, good day. I'm Rachel Wyan and I'm your reporter in Chapter 5, Imperial Reforms and Colonial Practice from 1763 to 1774. In this chapter, I will be going to discuss to you 5 topics. First is confronting the national debt, the aftermath of the French and Indian War. Second is the Stamp Act and the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. Third is the Townshend Acts and Colonial Practice, followed by the destruction of the Tea and the Coercive Acts. And the last but not the least is the Disaffection, the First Continental Congress and American Identity. And each topic is composed of around 3 to 4 subtopics. But before we start, please bear with me if there are some words that I can't pronounce correctly. I am actually experiencing difficulties in terms of pronouncing lately because of the current situation of my teeth. So, let's start. This figure illustrates the Bostonians paying the exciseman or tarring and feathering in 1774. It also depicts the most publicized tarring and feathering incident during the American Revolution. For the information of everybody, this can be found on page 125 on a resource material given to us by Sir Aye. And in addition to this illustration, it also shows the Boston Tea Party regarding the protest against the Tea Act of 1773 in relation also with the Stamp Act of 1765. Anyway, this will be the content of the following topics, so hold on and be with me because everything is very exciting in this chapter. We have learned from the previous chapter how Great Britain emerged victorious against the French. Now, the British Empire had celebrated their triumph. However, there are also problems that was totally produced despite the victory they have claimed. So in this part, we will be going to learn the status of Great Britain's colonies, specifically the North Americans. So we will be going to describe the size and scope of the British debt as well as the response to the debt crisis. On top of that, we're going to know the purpose of the Proclamation Line, the Sugar Act, as well as the Currency Act. It was in the year 1763 when the war between France and Great Britain ended, and it was the Great Britain who claimed victorious. Because of that, they had celebrated, they sang glorious songs, kaya nga lang nagkaroon sila ng utang na siyang naging malaking problema. So imagine, it became the most serious issue faced by Great Britain. Aside from that, they also need to secure their frontier and able to prevent another expensive war. So due to that, they enforced imperial trade laws as a way of raising revenue for them to pay their debt. Everybody was required to contribute, including those British subjects na naroon across the Atlantic. Pagkatapos ng digmaan, Britain claimed a huge expansion of territory. Dahil na rin sa kasunduang Treaty of Paris, tuluyan ang nawala ang existence ng French territory or commonly known as the New France. So because of that, British territorial holdings extended from Canada to Florida. Because of that, the British military focused on maintaining peace in the King's enlarged territories. On the other hand, much of the land in the American British Empire remained under control of powerful native confederacies, and it made claims of British mastery. Besides, Great Britain also maintained 10,000 troops in North America and able to guard the borders, lalo na kapag may posibilidad na ng pag-atake mula sa mga kalaban. On the other hand, there were also Britain colonies who were land hungry, and it resulted to a possible conflict because of their quest of land. We can read it further on page 127. Aside from that, some also viewed conflict as an opportunity para makakuha ng karagdagang kalakal from both parties. For example, nang matalo yung mga French, malaki yung nawala dun sa mga Indians who sided with the French, aside from losing a bargaining power from Great Britain. Mula nang manalo ang Great Britain, gibag-o na pud nila tanan. Ilahang claim ang former French ports, but they don't successfully claim the favor of those local tribes. In addition, they also reduced the amount of gunpowder and ammunition nga ilang ginabaligya sa locals. That is why it resulted to a unhealthy relationship leading to its resistance. And Indians' resistance to colonists drew upon the teachings of Delaware, or is known as Lenny Lenape, Prophet Newlin, and the leadership of Ottawa War Chief Pontiac. He was actually a spiritual leader and wanted to expel Europeans from their land. That is why Newlin's belief united Indians from villages, then dito tayo nakahuna-huna dayon sila nga mag-rebellion. So this is it. In 1761, Pontiac led a loose coalition of native tribes against the colonists and the British Army. So the Ojibwas, the Potawatomis, and the Hurons, they went to Fort Detroit, while the Senecas, the Shawnees, and the Delawares, they went to Fort Pitt. The Pontiac's Rebellion, or commonly known as Pontiac's War, triggered the British as well as the Indians. Naging matindi ang hatred ng mga colonists dahil sa nabalitaan nilang pagsalakay in a way of murdering, scalping, burning, and other violent ways of attacks. Next is the Paxton Boys. Paxton Boys viewed all Indians as savages. That is why they killed the 6 Canistoga they found. And according to Benjamin Franklin, the Paxton Boys are barbarous men who committed a atrocious act. Sabi yung naging galit ng mga British colonists. That is why they wanted to get the justice. They wanted to capture the Paxton Boys. However, it came up that Paxton Boys had many supporters than haters or critics. Then, Paxton Boys as well as the Pontiac's Rebellion is an example of the early American race war, by the sense that ginasunod lang nila ang message ni Prophet Newlin, as what I have said on the other slide, that they should join together against the British to get independence. Then, this ended in 1766. The British government took its step to prevent war, so they issued the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade white settlement west of the Proclamation Line. This Proclamation Line aimed to prevent conflict on the frontier. In short, this line served as a setback to their vision of westward expansion. Moving on to the British national debt. In large empire means a greater financial burden. So yung debt nila na 75 million euro in 1756, mas dumoble pa siya pagdating ng 1763 kasi naging 133 million euro na siya. So what the powerful members of the aristocracy did, they convinced the Prime Minister John Stewart to refrain from raising taxes on land. So what happened is the greater tax burden fell on the lower classes in a form of raising import duties by raising the prices of the imported goods, just like the sugar and tobacco. And in 1763, George Grenville succeeded as Prime Minister. He limited government spending and assuring that American colonists did their part to pay down the huge debt as a subject of the British Empire. Now let's move on to imperial reforms. By the mid-1760s, the new era of greater British interest in American colonies through imperial reforms. By 1764, Prime Minister Grenville introduced the Currency Act of 1764 that prohibits the colonies from printing additional paper money. Besides, they require the colonists to pay British merchants in gold and silver. Kasi naman sa gumamit sila ng colonial paper money. So, okay. This act aimed to standardize the currency used in Atlantic trade, because it will actually help the Empire to stabilize its economy, and American economic activity is under the Greater British control. Yung mga colonies naman, they depend only on their own paper currency in conducting trade, at dahil na rin sa maliit na supply ng gold at silver, they found their finances tight. So, they can do nothing and they just complain about it silently. Next is the Sugar Act of 1764. From 6 pence per gallon, it became 3 na lang because it lowered duties of British molasses by half. Then, it was established and able to address the rampant colonial smuggling, particularly with the French sugar islands in the West Indies. Next is Sugar Act of 1764 make the colonial traders to engage in illegal trade. Just for example, the New England mariners. This act is designed for them and able to be easier for them to comply with the Imperial law. Third is this act required violators to be in vice admiralty courts, wherein they settle disputes that occurred at sea operated without juries. Let's go to the British Constitution. It prescribes the roles of the King, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. Every entity provided a balance, lalo na sa mga posibilidad na maaring mangyari. For example, if ever the king had too much power, tyranny would be the result of this. What if the lords have too much power? Then, the result would be oligarchy. I'm assuming that everybody here already know what tyranny and oligarchy is. And how about if the commons have the balance of power? Then it would possibly result to democracy, or perhaps there would be a mob or destructive actions caused by the commons. I hope you get my point. Anyway, this could be found on page 129 to 130. We are now on the second part of this chapter, which is the Stamp Act and the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. In this section, we will be going to learn about the Stamp Act, its purpose, and especially the colonial responses pertaining this Act of 1765. This is Prime Minister Grenville, who was the one who introduced the Stamp Act. Because of this act, anyone who used anything which is printed on paper is required to purchase a revenue stamp. This act basically signaled the shift in British policy. From November 1, 1765, the colonists were required to contribute 60,000 euro per year for the maintenance of 10,000 British soldiers na naroon sa North America. This act actually set off serious protests against British Imperial policy. So after introducing the Stamp Act, the Parliament also passed the Quartering Act in the same year. This act actually addressed the problem of housing British soldiers stationed in the American colonies. Under this act, those British soldiers are required to be provided with places to stay as well as extra housing at pati na rin mga foods. Ever since sa panahon pa ni James II, ganun din ang nangyari, kaya it became arguing specifically in New York in 1776 wherein their assembly had refused to follow this act. Now, let's proceed to the colonial parties, gentry, merchants, and the Stamp Act Congress. The Stamp Act raised many concerns, lalo na sa mga British colonies na naroon sa Amerika. As a direct tax, it seemed to be an unconstitutional measure since it can deprive the freeborn British subjects of their liberty. Next is no taxation without representation. This phrase simply means that only representatives for whom British subjects voted could tax them. For example, if a particular British subject voted for Mr. Bean to be in that representative body, then Mr. Bean can tax the particular British subject. But what if Mr. Paragoso collects a tax but then he was not imposed to be the representative of a particular subject? Then, it should not be allowed kasi nga, wala siyang consent. I hope you get my point. Okay, let's move on. In response to the Stamp Act, the Massachusetts Assembly sent letters to different colonies para mapag-usapan nila kung paano nga ba o ano nga ba ang magiging response nila. Kasi nga, there were several American colonies who opposed the Stamp Act. So, in 1765, the representatives from 9 various colonial legislatures met in New York to reach a consensus. So, what's their agenda on the consensus? Well, they wanted to repeal the tax kasi nga, weaken their colonial economy. Hindi lang yan, it also threatened their liberty under the British Constitution. So, because of that, the Declaration of Rights and Grievances outlined the unconstitutionality of taxation with representation and trials without juries. Isa din ito sa mga naging dahilan kung bakit may mga protest na nabuo. Next is mobilization, popular protest against the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act Congress is the gathering of land-owning, educated white men who represented the political elite of the colonies. Then, we have the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty who led popular resistance to the Stamp Act. They consider themselves British patriots defending their liberty. We have the Sons of Liberty who made a brutal response by a means of protesting to the Stamp Act, just like what they did to Andrew Oliver and Thomas Hutchinson, who were both members of the Parliament's action, especially the Stamp Act. They did violent actions and able to show their distaste and protest with the goal of securing the resignation of all stamp collectors. They are composed of artisans, shopkeepers, and small-time merchants. Then we have the Daughters of Liberty. They refuse to buy British goods and they also encourage others to do the same. They make their own teas using local herbs and berries. They also create their own cloth just to avoid the British manufacturers unless it would be repealed. The Daughters of Non-Importation Movement gave women a new active role in political dissent of time. Since women were responsible of buying goods at home, they could mobilize others and make a difference even though they can't vote. On the other hand, John Adams supported the goals of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, but he never engaged to its violent actions specifically with what the Sons of Liberty did. Grenville's Imperial reform brought an increased domestic taxes that led him to a dismiss by King George III. British merchants also wanted to repeal the Stamp Act because of the non-importation movement is affecting their business badly. So in March 1766, Lord Rockingham became the new Prime Minister and he repealed the Stamp Act. And in return, he also proposed a declaratory act enable for the Parliament's power still supreme. In this section, we're going to learn the 1767 Townshend Act, especially its purpose as well as the reason of the protests among the colonies leading to different consequences. Now, let's go to the Townshend Acts. Lord Rockingham was dismissed by George III and he was succeeded by William Pitt, who came to be sympathetic to the colonies. However, he was old and sick, so Charles Townshend took his duties, who came to be his Chancellor of the Exchequer. One of his jobs was to manage the empire's finances, especially in raising revenue from the colonies. The following are the Townshend Acts. First is the Restraining Act of 1767, which disbanded the New York Assembly. He did this able to deal with unruly New York Assembly kasi nga they don't want to pay the supplies for the garrison of British soldiers na gina-require sa Quartering Act. Second is the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767. These items were paper, paint, lead, tea, and glass that need to be imported kasi nga the colonies don't have the manufacturing base. The third one is the Indemnity Act of 1767, which exempted tea produced by the British India Company from taxation. This was seen to be an example of corruption that going widely in the parliament. Fourth one is the Revenue Act, which gave the Customs Board greater assistance. This Revenue Act gave them a measure of independence. Kining mga revenue nga ginakolekt, it is intended to support the British Army in America. However, it also gave the Customs Board the power to counteract smuggling. Fifth is the Commissioners of Customs Act of 1767, which created an American Board of Customs to enforce law. It is introduced to ensure compliance. However, it does not perfectly enforce the laws kasi nga the enforcement was based on Great Britain and medyo may kalayuan din siya tsaka smuggling was rampant. Then, the Vice Admiralty Court Act was established on Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. It is enabling for the violators of customs regulation without a jury. In short, despite the different laws implemented by Townshend, di pa rin nila na-resolba ang problema kasi nga nagiging malala pa ang mga controversies and practices in the American colonies, and they continually finding solutions on how to solve these issues, particularly their debt. We are now in reactions to the non-importation movement. Due to the effects of the Townshend Acts, there are many protest writings generated, and one of these was the Letters from Pennsylvania Farmer by John Dickinson. This pamphlet became influential, arguing about the Empire's trade regulation as well as its dislikes regarding the Parliament's imposing internal as well as external taxes. Then, we have the Massachusetts Circular by Samuel Adams. It laid out the unconstitutionality of taxation without representation. It also encouraged other colonies to protest again pertaining the taxes in a way of boycotting British goods. So, the response of the Great Britain was lukewarm. However, Lord Hillsborough demanded that Massachusetts should retract the letter, and he promised that any colonial assemblies who endorse it would be dissolved. Additionally, the Daughters of Liberty continued to support and promote the boycott of British goods. Kung unsa to ilang ginahimo ato ginapadayon gihapon nila. Then next is the Sons of Liberty used newspaper and circulars to call out merchants who refused to sign their agreements. Then the boycott 1768 to 1769 turned the purchase of consumer goods into a political gesture. We're now in trouble in Boston. In 1768, Lord Hillsborough sent 4,000 British troops in Boston, unable to deal the issue and to put down the possible rebellion. So because of that, Boston's labor system had been closed, leading many Bostonians to help the Sons of Liberty. Then they made a campaign against the British troops. And John Hancock supported the Sons Liberty's aim. So who is John Hancock? He is actually a most successful merchant, and he worked actively with the Sons of Liberty. Then, in 1768, customs officials seized the Liberty, and in March 5, 1770, Boston's massacre started and there violence erupted. Naging matindi ang digmaan. Dayon, si Paul Revere, who was a member of the Sons of Liberty, circulated an engraving who showed merciless actions towards the civilians. Then, John Adams represented the British soldiers as their murder trial. Next is the partial repeal. On the late 1760s, the American boycott of British goods drastically reduced British trade. Kaya yung mga merchants, they keep on pressuring the Parliament to break the non-importation movement. By 1767, Townshend died and was replaced by Lord North. And North convinced the Parliament to drop all the Townshend duties except the tax on tea. The American Board of Customs Commissioners and the Vice Admiralty Courts remain in place kahit na i-drop ni North yung mga Townshend duties. And because of his decision, it appeared to be a major victory to the majority. In this part, we're going to learn about the socio-political environment in the colonies in early 1770s. Then we'll also learn about the purpose of the Act of 1773 and the colonial reactions in relation to this act, as well as we're going to identify the coercive acts. Smoldering resentment. Suspicion of Parliament's intention remained high. This picture is the two treatises of government by philosopher John Locke. It influenced the political thought pertaining the role of the government in protecting life, liberty, and property. In 1772, Rhode Island colonies boarded and burned a British revenue ship named Basque in Narragansett Bay. So that is the picture. Then, after this incident, the British government summoned a particular Royal Commission of Inquiry. This Royal Commission had the authority to remove the colonists who were responsible of doing this violence para naman dumaan sila sa trial doon sa Great Britain. Kaya naman, yung mga protesters, they view this incident as an example of outsmarting of the British power. Then the Committee of Correspondence, reformed by Samuel Adams and Joseph Warren, as well as James Otis, functioned as a form of shadow government. It is to address the fear of the British overreach. So, different colonies, especially the Massachusetts, they formed their own committees. Then later on, they gathered together for the rebellion against the Tea Act hanggang sa mag-revolt sila against the British Crown. Moving on to the Tea Act of 1773. This act is a straightforward order of economic protectionism for a British tea from the East India Company. Kasi nga, during the time, the East India Company was on the point of bankruptcy. Then, this act also gave the British East India Company the ability to export its tea. This act allowed the British East India Company to export its tea without paying import or export duties, even with the Townshend tax, while the tea from the East India Company was given lower prices compared sa mga smuggled tea from Britain. So imagine, mag-inunsidate ang mga merchants, and it also brought anger sa ilaha. Then, the tea is one remaining consumer good subject to the hated Townshend duties. And furthermore, the tea also symbolized the idea of no taxation without representation. The 1773 Act appeared to be part of a huge conspiracy against liberty. Then colonies responded to the Tea Act with a boycott. Because of this act, it appeared to be approved that the corrupt members of the parliament were violating the British Constitution. So the committees of correspondence also helped to coordinate resistance in all colonial port cities up and down the East Coast para kanang maharangan nila nga ma-unload ang mga British tea, because it was their way of stopping the ships, and they firstly want to send the ships back to Great Britain. So the Charleston, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, an equivalent of $1 million worth of tea was held hostage. Then Thomas Hutchinson urged the merchants who accepted the tea to stand their ground and receive the tea once it had been unloaded. So Dartmouth, which is a ship, sailed into Boston Harbor in November 1773, and it was then followed by Eleanor and Gifford. Then Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty find their ways to make sure that tea would not be unloaded. Pagka December 16 dayon, 3 ships arrived. So kadtong grupo sa Sons of Liberty systematically dumped all tea into the harbor by disguising themselves as Mohawks, and the tea was worth $1 million. Ito yung nag-udyok upang mas dumami pa ang resistance. Because of the destruction of the tea, mas nagalit pa si King George III, lalo na si Lord North. Kaya naman, they insisted the loss to be repaid. However, the Massachusetts Assembly refused to make payments. and it united different factions in Great Britain against the colonies. Kaya naman, naubos yung pasensya ni Lord North, kaya nagdeklara siya na Massachusetts should be forced to pay for the tea and yield to British authority. So, unable to punish Massachusetts, the Parliament leaders designed the Coercive Acts. The Boston Port Bill shuts down Boston Harbor. The Massachusetts Government Act placed the colonial government under direct control of the Crown officials, and there were also traditional town meetings, and the Administration of Justice Act allowed the royal governments to unilaterally move any trial of a crown officer. However, it also angered to some, especially John Adams, since he saw this act as striking the equitable justice. Then, at the same time, Parliament also passed the Quebec Act, which expanded the boundaries of Quebec westward and extended religious tolerance, specifically the Roman Catholic in the province. This act also appeared to be a slap in the face of the colonies angered by coercive acts. So, to sum up, these acts, which were the coercive and Quebec Acts, are renamed intolerable acts among the American patriots. In this part, I'll be going to discuss to you the affairs between the colonies and the home government in 1774, as well as I'll be going to explain the purpose and result of the First Continental Congress. So, several colonies viewed the Coercive Act as well as the Quebec Act as a turning point for them to take an action. That is why it resulted to the First Continental Congress, which challenged Lord North and the British authorities. So after the passage of the Intolerable Acts, the Sons of Liberty began to spread different views and warnings regarding the effects of the Intolerable Acts on the liberty. So the Suffolk Resolves was passed in September 1774, which laid out a plan of resistance to the Intolerable Acts. So the First Continental Congress was made up of 12 representatives of the 13 American colonies. So, to make it short, these representatives created a Continental Association to ensure that the full boycott was enforced by all the colonies. Moreover, this Congress established a governing network in opposition to royal authority. Then, it also meant that they are still considered as a British subject, but they were slowly moving away from the British authority. And this Congress also was becoming an elected government. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you and stay safe, everyone. See you on chapter 6.